Commander Xylox of the Centauri stood tall, his imposing figure contrasting sharply with the Earth kitchen he found himself in. He had never set foot in such a space before. His own world, Centaur Prime, had little use for individual kitchens. There, food was a communal affair, a strictly functional activity conducted in sterile, shared spaces where efficiency was prioritized above all else. But Xylox wasn't on Centaur Prime, he was on Earth, and he was determined to understand these humans on their own terms. He believed that the heart of human culture might just lie within these quaint rituals like cooking. The idea had struck Xylox during one of the many diplomatic receptions held in Earth's honor. The humans had celebrated with food, lots of it, served in a dizzying variety of colors and textures. Some dishes were creamy, some crunchy, others sticky, and a few even bubbled on the platters as if they were alive. The sense of joy and community that the humans displayed while eating was foreign to Xylox. It was this strange and enigmatic connection with food that had inspired him to experience it for himself. Cooking, he had decided, would allow him to immerse in human culture beyond what diplomatic talks could offer. He knew this would be unconventional, even risky. Centauri customs did not generally encourage deviations from protocol, especially during diplomatic missions. But Xylox was known for his curiosity, often seen as a peculiar trait in the rigid hierarchy of the Centauri fleet, and his desire to truly understand Earth's people had driven him to this experiment. So it was that Xylox found himself standing in the kitchen of the Earth Embassy, surrounded by bright vegetables, a packet of spaghetti, several jars of strange condiments, and an earnest human diplomat named Sarah. She had been assigned to guide him through this cultural endeavor, her curiosity piqued by the commander's unusual request. With her auburn hair pulled back into a messy bun and a warm smile, Sarah was the perfect contrast to Xylox's serious, almost solemn demeanor. She could tell he was eager, though his Centauri expressions were hard to read. There was a spark in his deep-set eyes that conveyed determination. "Commander Xylox, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. "Cooking can be unpredictable." Xylox nodded, his features set with resolve. "If I am to understand the human culture fully, then I must experience it as you do," he stated, his deep voice carrying a weight that made even a simple cooking session sound like a battle campaign. Sarah smiled again, a little nervously. She had heard stories of the Centauri and their strict ways, how they abhorred chaos, how each action was calculated and deliberate. She couldn't help but wonder if Xylox fully comprehended what he was getting into. Cooking, especially in human kitchens, was hardly ever straightforward, especially for those unfamiliar with their complexities. "All right then," she said, clapping her hands together. "We'll start with something simple: spaghetti with tomato sauce. It's a classic." Xylox examined the ingredients laid out before him. The bright red tomatoes, the pale strands of uncooked spaghetti, the green herbs, and a variety of powders and spices were all foreign to him. He picked up a tomato, turning it over in his large, gloved hands as if it were some kind of alien artifact. To him, it practically was. "What is this?" he inquired, his brow furrowing in concentration. "That's a tomato," Sarah explained. "It's one of the key ingredients in the sauce. It's juicy, slightly sweet, and gives the sauce its base flavor." Xylox nodded thoughtfully and placed the tomato down, then picked up a clove of garlic, staring at it with the same intensity. "And this?" Sarah chuckled softly. "That's garlic. It adds a lot of flavor. We'll chop it finely and add it to the oil for the sauce." Xylox nodded once more. He was determined to master this, even if every ingredient was an unknown challenge. Sarah moved around the kitchen, handing him a knife. "Let's start by chopping the garlic," she suggested. Xylox took the knife with the kind of reverence that might befit a warrior receiving a sacred blade. He positioned the garlic clove carefully on the cutting board, raising the knife with deliberate precision. His hands moved mechanically, slicing the garlic into neat, uniform pieces. Sarah watched, biting her lip. He was a bit too careful cooking, after all, required a certain flow, a rhythm that Xylox hadn't yet found. "Great job, Commander," Sarah encouraged, though she could see this was going to take a while. As Xylox continued to chop, she turned her attention to the stove, heating up a pan with a bit of olive oil. The kitchen began to fill with a light, welcoming aroma as the garlic sizzled, and Sarah couldn't help but smile. She was used to this, but it was clear that Xylox was far from his element. Once the garlic was ready, Sarah handed Xylox a can of crushed tomatoes. "Pour this in," she instructed. Xylox obeyed, watching as the thick red substance spilled into the pan, mixing with the golden garlic oil. He leaned in closer, his nostrils flaring slightly as he tried to comprehend the aromas wafting up. "Smells complex," he noted, his tone filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for an impressive piece of machinery. Sarah chuckled. "It's the combination of flavors. We're building layers," she said, reaching for a small jar of dried oregano. "Now let's add some seasoning. This is oregano, it's an herb that adds depth to the sauce." She handed the jar to Xylox, who examined it for a moment before opening the lid. The pungent scent made him pause. "Depth," he repeated, as if tasting the word. The Centauri language didn't have a direct translation for such a concept related to food. Food was fuel, not an experience to be layered. This was already beyond his understanding. Xylox sprinkled some oregano into the sauce, watching it disappear into the bubbling mixture. Then came salt and a pinch of sugar, each element added under Sarah's careful supervision. With every new ingredient, Xylox asked a question: why salt? Why sugar? How did these things change the taste? And Sarah answered patiently, trying her best to explain the nuances of human cooking to a being who saw everything in stark, functional terms. Then they reached the spices. Sarah pointed to a collection of small containers on the counter. "These are spices," she said, her tone a little wary. "They're potent, and a little goes a long way. We'll add a bit of pepper, and maybe a pinch of this." She picked up a container of chili powder and showed it to Xylox. "This is chili powder. It's spicy, adds heat. But you have to be very careful not too much." Xylox nodded, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes. Spicy. Heat. He liked the idea of something with a kick. It sounded bold, intense, much like the warrior culture of his people. Perhaps this was something he could relate to. Before Sarah could intervene, Xylox took the jar from her and, with the confidence of someone who had made a decision, added a generous spoonful of the fiery red powder to the sauce. Sarah's eyes widened. "Commander, that's quite a lot," she started, but Xylox was already stirring the sauce, his expression pleased. "I wish to experience it fully," he said, his voice resolute. "I will not do this halfway." Sarah bit her lip, trying not to show her worry. She watched as Xylox stirred the sauce, oblivious to the mistake he had just made. She hoped it wouldn't be too much. Maybe Centauri were more resilient to spice, she thought. Maybe it would be fine. They continued cooking, with Xylox adding the spaghetti to boiling water, his movements stiff but purposeful. The scent of the sauce grew stronger, filling the small kitchen with a heady mix of tomatoes, garlic, and the sharp, unmistakable sting of chili. Sarah could feel her eyes begin to water slightly from the potency of the spice, and she glanced over at Xylox, who seemed unaffected for now. Finally, the spaghetti was ready. Sarah drained it, mixing it with the spicy tomato sauce while Xylox watched intently. The dish was complete, a simple bowl of pasta that seemed, to Xylox, like a grand achievement. He had made this, from raw ingredients, with his own hands. It was a feeling he rarely experienced, creating something that wasn't purely utilitarian. "It is ready?" he asked, looking at Sarah for confirmation. She nodded, though her apprehension was hard to hide. "Yes, Commander, it's ready. Would you like to taste it?" Xylox took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the bowl before him. He picked up a fork, another foreign tool, and awkwardly twisted some spaghetti around its tines, mimicking the way he had seen humans do it. Slowly, he raised it to his lips, taking the first bite. At first, there was nothing. He chewed, his expression blank as he analyzed the texture, the taste, the sweetness of the tomatoes, the aromatic garlic, the subtle bitterness of the herbs. All of it was new, and he was trying to process it. But then, the spice hit. Xylox's eyes widened, his mouth parting slightly as the heat of the chili spread across his tongue, then down his throat. It was as if a fire had ignited inside him, the intensity far beyond anything he had anticipated. He swallowed quickly, his body stiffening, his eyes beginning to water. "Commander?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. She could see his face beginning to change color, a deep, unsettling shade of violet. "Are you all right?" Xylox nodded, though it was a strained motion. "It is." Intense, he managed to say, his voice now hoarse. The heat continued to build, and Xylox's body reacted instinctively, his respiratory system kicking into overdrive to expel the perceived threat. He gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His eyes were now streaming, and the violet shade on his face deepened. "Commander," Sarah exclaimed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen humans struggle with spice before, but this was different, this was serious. She rushed to the sink, filling a glass with water and handing it to him. "Here, drink this." Xylox took the glass, downing the water in one go. But it did little to quench the burning sensation that seemed to radiate from his core. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the empty glass on the counter, his breathing still labored. "More," he croaked, and Sarah hurried to refill the glass. As she handed it to him, she realized the gravity of the situation. The Centauri physiology was clearly not equipped to handle capsaicin in the way humans could. What had been a bold experiment had quickly turned into something dangerous. The other Centauri delegates, who had been waiting in the adjoining room, heard the commotion and rushed in, their eyes widening at the sight of their commander in distress. One of them, an officer named Varn, immediately assumed the worst. "Poison," Varn shouted, his gaze snapping to Sarah, his eyes filled with accusation. "The human has poisoned Commander Xylox." Sarah's heart sank as panic spread through the room. The other delegates drew their weapons, their forms rigid with tension. No, Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's not poison, it's just chili. He added too much spice." But Varn was not listening, his focus entirely on the struggling form of his commander. "We must extract him immediately," he ordered, and two Centauri guards moved forward, grabbing Xylox under his arms to support him. Sarah watched in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. What had started as a simple cultural exchange had turned into a diplomatic disaster. She had to do something, anything, to fix it. But as the Centauri guards began to escort Xylox out of the kitchen, she feared it might already be too late. The commotion that had erupted in the kitchen quickly spread throughout the embassy, like a wildfire blazing out of control. Alarms blared, echoing through the long corridors, and the tense voices of Centauri delegates mixed with the worried murmurs of human staff. What had started as a culinary experiment had turned into a situation that threatened to become an intergalactic incident. Sarah was frantic, her heart racing as she tried to catch up with Commander Xylox and the Centauri guards. They were moving quickly, their long strides carrying them out of the kitchen and down the hallway, past startled human diplomats who had no idea what was happening. Sarah's mind was a blur, panic settling in as she imagined the consequences. How could something as innocent as cooking lead to this? The Centauri were a proud and disciplined people, and any sign of perceived treachery could have disastrous consequences for Earth's diplomatic relations. "Wait," she called out, her voice barely audible above the alarms. "It's not poison, it's a misunderstanding." She ran after them, her shoes slapping against the polished floor as she weaved between embassy staff who had come out of their offices to see what was going on. Commander Xylox was in obvious distress, his face still a deep shade of violet. His breathing was shallow, each gasp coming with a pained wheeze. His eyes, though watering and unfocused, still retained a glint of determination. Even in this vulnerable state, he tried to maintain his dignity, struggling against the guards who supported him, unwilling to appear weak. Varn, the officer who had shouted the accusation, turned back to look at Sarah, his expression hard and unforgiving. His voice was filled with suspicion as he spoke. "You say it is a misunderstanding, human, but look at him. The commander is in pain, and we must ensure his safety. You will not interfere." Sarah felt a pang of frustration, her stomach churning with anxiety. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had to make them understand. She couldn't let them leave thinking this was an attack. But she knew that reasoning with this Centauri, especially in a moment of crisis, was nearly impossible. They were trained to be distrustful of anything unfamiliar, and this Commander Xylox collapsing after consuming human food was about as foreign as it got. The Centauri guards led Xylox through the hallway toward the main entrance of the embassy, where their transport vehicle waited. It was a sleek, imposing vessel that hovered just above the ground, its surface a reflective black that seemed to absorb the light around it. Sarah knew that if they took Xylox off embassy grounds, it would be even harder to convince them of the truth. She had to act now. "Please, just give me a moment," Sarah called out, her voice desperate as she caught up to them. She reached out, her hand brushing Varn's arm. He stopped abruptly, turning to face her, his eyes narrowing. "You have 10 seconds, he said, his tone cold. Sarah swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. She could see the other Centauri watching her, their expressions unreadable. She knew she had to choose her words carefully. Any hint of hesitation or uncertainty, and they would dismiss her entirely. "It was the chili powder," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Commander Xylox added too much. It's a spice that humans use, but it's very strong. It's not poison. It's just that his body isn't used to it." Varn's eyes narrowed further, his skepticism evident. "And how do we know this isn't a lie to cover your actions? The commander trusted you, and now he suffers." Sarah felt a lump in her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You can test the food," she said. "Take it to your lab, analyze it. You'll see there's nothing harmful in it. I swear to you, I would never harm Commander Xylox." This was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill, a way to understand each other better. For a moment, there was silence. Varn studied her, his gaze piercing as if he were trying to see into her very soul. The other Centauri stood tense, their hands still hovering near their weapons, ready to act at a moment's notice. Sarah could feel the sweat on her brow, her heart pounding as she waited for Varn's response. Finally, Varn turned to the guards holding Xylox. "Take him to the med bay on the ship," he ordered. "We will have our own physicians examine him, and bring the food. We will test it for any toxins." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't a complete victory, but at least they weren't leaving under the assumption that it was a deliberate attack. She watched as the guards helped Xylox into the transport vehicle, his form hunched over, still struggling to breathe. Varn turned back to Sarah, his expression still stern. "You will remain here, human. If we find any trace of deceit, there will be consequences." Sarah nodded, her throat dry. "I understand." As the transport vehicle's doors closed and it lifted off the ground, disappearing into the sky, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She leaned against the wall, her legs weak. She had done everything she could, but now it was out of her hands. She could only hope that these Centauri physicians would be able to help Xylox and that the tests would prove her innocence. The next few hours were a blur for Sarah. The embassy was in a state of high alert, with security personnel scrambling to ensure that there were no further incidents. She was questioned repeatedly by both her superiors and the Centauri delegates who had remained behind, each interview more exhausting than the last. She explained the situation over and over again, how Xylox had wanted to cook, how he had insisted on adding the chili powder despite her warning. Each time, she could see the doubt in their eyes. It was clear that they found it hard to believe that such a small thing could cause such a crisis. As evening fell, Sarah found herself in the embassy's lounge, slumped in a chair with a cup of lukewarm tea in her hands. She stared out the window, watching the sky darken as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her thoughts were consumed by what had happened, by the look of pain on Xylox's face, by the fear that this incident could unravel all the progress that had been made in diplomatic relations between Earth and Xentar Prime. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Sarah?" She looked up to see her colleague, Daniel, standing in the doorway. He was one of the senior diplomats at the embassy, a kind man who had always been supportive of her work. His brow was furrowed with concern as he approached her. "How are you holding up?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. Sarah shrugged, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know, Daniel. It all happened so fast. One moment we were cooking, and the next. Everything just fell apart." Daniel nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I've heard. The Centauri are a proud people. Any sign of weakness or mistake can be seen as a threat to their honor. But I think you did the right thing, trying to explain. It might have prevented an even worse outcome." Sarah sighed, setting her cup down on the table. "I just hope they believe me, if they think this was an attack." Daniel reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "We'll get through this. The truth will come out. And besides, Xylox is tough. He'll pull through." Sarah managed a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're right." Meanwhile, aboard the Centauri ship, Commander Xylox lay in the medbay, his body still racked with the effects of the chili powder. The Centauri physicians worked quickly, administering a series of treatments to counteract the intense reaction. They monitored his vital signs, their faces grim as they watched the readings on the various monitors. Varn stood nearby, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes never leaving Xylox. He felt a deep sense of responsibility for his commander, and seeing him in this state filled him with both anger and fear. He had always been wary of the humans, their unpredictability, their strange customs. And now, his worst fears seemed to have come true. One of the physicians approached Varn, her expression cautious. "The commander is stable for now, but he is still experiencing significant discomfort. We believe the substance he ingested was a spice, as the human claimed. It is called capsaicin, and it appears to be highly irritating to Centauri physiology." Varn's jaw tightened. "So it was not poison?" The physician shook her head. "No, not in the sense of a deliberate toxin. It was simply too much for his system to handle. The human was telling the truth." Varn was silent for a moment, his eyes moving to Xylox, who was lying with his eyes closed, his breathing still shallow. He felt a mix of emotions, relief that it had not been an attack, but also frustration at the fact that such a simple mistake could lead to such dire consequences. "What are his chances of recovery?" Varn asked, his voice low. The physician hesitated. "He will recover, but it will take time. His body has undergone a significant shock. He will need rest, and we will continue to monitor him closely." Varn nodded, his expression unreadable. He turned back to Xylox, his mind racing with thoughts of what this meant for their mission, for their relationship with the humans. This incident would not be easily forgotten, not by the Centauri and certainly not by him. Back at the embassy, the tension was palpable. The human diplomats were on edge, waiting for any word from the Centauri ship. Sarah remained in the lounge, unable to focus on anything else. She replayed the events of the day over and over in her mind, wondering if there was anything she could have done differently, anything that could have prevented this outcome. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her from her thoughts, and she looked up to see Daniel returning, his expression grave. "There's a communication from the Centauri ship," he said, his voice tense. "They want to speak with you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She stood quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she followed Daniel to the communications room. She had no idea what to expect, whether this would be the end of her career, or worse, the start of a conflict between Earth and Zentaur Prime. The communications room was dimly lit, the large screen at the far end displaying the emblem of the Zentauri fleet. As Sarah stepped inside, the screen flickered, and the image of Officer Varn appeared. His expression was stern, his eyes locking onto Sarah's. "Human diplomat Sarah," Varn began, his voice formal. "We have completed our analysis of the events that transpired today." Sarah swallowed, her mouth dry. "Yes, Officer Varn." Varn's gaze was piercing, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, he gave a slight nod. "Our physicians have confirmed that the substance ingested by Commander Psylocke was not a poison, but a spice native to your world. The commander is recovering, though his condition remains serious. It appears that your explanation was truthful." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, her shoulders sagging as the tension began to release. "Thank you, Officer Varn. I'm truly sorry for what happened. It was never my intention to cause harm." Varn's expression remained stern. "Your apology is noted. However, this incident will have consequences. The Centauri people value strength and precision, and what occurred today was a failure on multiple levels. Trust has been compromised." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy. "I understand. I only hope that we can find a way to move forward, to repair the damage that has been done." Varn was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again, his tone slightly softer. "Commander Psylocke requested that I convey his appreciation for your efforts to assist him. He recognizes that you acted in good faith, despite the outcome." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and gratitude filling her chest. "Thank you. Please let Commander Psylocke know that I wish him a swift recovery." Varn gave a curt nod. "We will be in contact regarding the future of our diplomatic relations. For now, the commander requires rest, and we must ensure his well-being." The screen flickered, and Varn's image disappeared, leaving the room in silence. Sarah let out a long breath, her hands still trembling as she turned to Daniel, who gave her a reassuring smile. "You did well, Sarah," he said. "It could have been much worse." Sarah managed a small smile, though her mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. She knew that this incident would leave a lasting mark on her career, on the embassy, and on the fragile relationship between Earth and Zentaur Prime. But at least, for now, the immediate crisis had been averted. Over the following days, the embassy worked tirelessly to repair the damage caused by the incident. Sarah spent hours in meetings, drafting reports, and discussing ways to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. It was exhausting, but she was determined to do everything she could to make things right. Eventually, word came from the Azentauri ship that Commander Psylocke was recovering well. The news brought a sense of relief to everyone at the embassy, though the tension remained. The Azentauri were still wary, their trust shaken, and it would take time to rebuild what had been lost. For Sarah, the experience was a harsh reminder of the complexities of intergalactic relations. It wasn't just about understanding different languages or customs, it was about understanding the very essence of what made each species unique, the things that could not be easily translated or explained. She had learned a valuable lesson, one that she would carry with her as she continued her work. And though the road ahead would be challenging, she remained hopeful. Hopeful that one day, the Azentauri and the humans could sit down together, share a meal, and truly understand one another not just through words, but through the shared experience of something as simple and as complex as food.